Good evening. I'm David Gergen, and I want to welcome all of you to the Kennedy School Forum, the premier forum here at the university, and indeed tonight we have a premier visitor. We're here to talk about leadership in corporate America, and our guest is Lou Gerstner, one of the most respected CEOs of the modern times, at a time when so many other icons have fallen. Lou Gerstner stands there as a symbol of someone who led American corporations, global corporations, in ways that have inspired not only investors, but have inspired the public with leadership, with his ethics, with his drive, with his vision about what an American company could be. This event tonight is co-sponsored by the Institute of Politics, by the Center for Public Leadership, which I'm proud to represent here, by the Center for Business and Government, by two student groups, Kennedy School Group on Science and Technology, as well as by a student group, the Consortium for Global Leadership, which is a new group that spreads across from business school, the Kennedy School, and the law school. Our guest, I must tell you, has just come from the business school where he spoke to a packed house, and it's been a long day for him. So we should understand that in the beginning, but it doubles our pleasure. Now, a word of background. As many of you know, during the course of the 20th century, IBM became a corporation that was symbolized in many ways America's dynamic economic strength. It grew. It was a leader in its industry for year after year, and the Watson name was associated with that. And then the industry changed dramatically. In 1990, IBM made more profits than it had in any other year in its history. The next 3 years, it cascaded downward as others gathered round, began to punch holes in, as Microsoft grew, as Intel grew, as these other competitors grew. IBM began sinking and sinking fast. Its mainframe computers, which were the heart and soul of the company, mainframe plus the software accounted for some 90% of the revenue for the company, that plunged. And as it plunged, the fate of IBM plunged. And IBM was headed for extinction. April 1, 1993, enter Lou Gerstner. Lou Gerstner is a fascinating man. I've had the privilege of knowing him for a few years. He grew up in Long Island, as he describes it, a middle-class Catholic family. His dad was a dispatcher for a brewing company. His mom was a secretary. She worked for a community college, a variety of other things in the community. This was a family of 4 boys. He was the third. They believed very strongly in education. They remortgaged their house every 4 years to pay for their children's education. He thought he was going to go to Notre Dame. Dartmouth came in with a better offer. Off he went to Dartmouth, and then he came here to the Harvard Business School, graduated at the age of 23. Went from there into McKinsey, where he rose to be a senior partner. From there to American Express, where he distinguished himself online in their travel industry. He was then picked up by RJR Nabisco as a CEO, a company that was heavily laden with debt at that time, but he came in to be the CEO. 4 years later, he was recruited by Jim Burke, formerly of Johnson & Johnson, as well as others, to come to IBM. It was a daring decision. Many said, this is a fellow who knows more about cookies than he knows about computers, coming out of RJR Nabisco. But he stepped in to a company that was near death. Within 6 months, it stopped the hemorrhaging, and then rebuilt that company into an industry leader, and now a global leader again. He's recently stepped down from that job as CEO, and he's written a book about his experiences. It's called Who Says Elephants Can't Dance? By Louis V. Gerstner, Jr. It's a wonderful book. Imus has been promoting the dickens out of this for the last days. He's been all over television. He's been in business schools. He's been at Stanford, at MIT, at the Harvard Business School, everywhere. The book has sailed upward. You've got another career, Lou Gerstner.
No, thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Lou Gerstner here. what was it like walking in that first few days?
Well, David, first let me tell you how delighted I am to be here, and that all of you have come out to hear from a retiring has-been who's giving up his career.
You may be retired, you're not retiring.
Thank you for coming. I was scared. I'm not really sure why I took the job. I've been asked that a lot. I turned the job down 3 times. I didn't think I had the technical background to run IBM. I just assumed you needed to be a technical wizard to run the world's most advanced technical company. And the people on the IBM board, led by Jim Burke, said, no, we don't think that's the problem. We think the problem is one of leadership. And I remember walking on a beach one day for a couple hours. I left my house to walk on the beach, convinced I was going to say no the final time, and I came back and I said yes. And I don't know, I guess I'm just a glutton for punishment. But I walked in the first day, and as I point out in my book, I actually couldn't get in the first day because in IBM you have to have a badge, as I suspect today is the case in most places, and I never got a badge. So I came to the building the first day, and it was 7 o'clock in the morning, and I couldn't get in the door. I just kept pounding on the door, and finally some cleaning lady came around, and then she opened the door just to get me to stop knocking on it. She had no idea who I was. Walking into an $80 billion company that is hemorrhaging cash, is frozen in place, yet had an incredible tradition, a pride, a justifiable pride among the people, was daunting, to say the least.
It was interesting to me that when Jim Burke came and appealed to you to do this, he did so partly on the argument that you need to do this for your country. It was an argument. It was an appeal to your patriotism.
He did do that. He did do that. He was really getting desperate at that point. And he said to me, if you don't do this, I'm going to call President Clinton, and he's going to call you and tell you you have to do this for your country. And the funny thing is that a week after I took the job, I was at an event in New York City, and a Nobel laureate came up to me, and he kind of pushed his finger in my chest, and he said, don't screw it up. You've got a national treasure that you have to fix. So Jim Burke wasn't the only one that laid that patriotism on me. And yet, as I finished my IBM career, I happen to believe IBM is a national treasure. It's an important institution.
Lou, from the point of view of leadership, it's fundamental. Leadership 101, establish a vision up front when you take it on. When you take on an organization. It was so interesting to me that early on when your first press conference came just shortly after you'd taken over, you said, there's been a lot of speculation as to when I'm going to deliver a vision of IBM. And what I'd like to say to all of you is that the last thing IBM needs right now is a vision. Why?
Well, I have a view about leadership that may be different in the academy or in government or in the non-profit sector. My view is leadership is measured not by what you say, but what your organization does. And I don't believe that leadership is singularly just pointing to the fences and giving a sense of direction. I think leadership is about doing that, yes, but then creating the environment in your organization where that path, that direction is in fact met, it's executed, that there's follow-on, there's execution, there's results. And the problem at IBM when I arrived was not that it could not see what it needed to do. It was not unaware of the changes in the environment. It was not without a lot of understanding of where it ought to go. The problem was it couldn't move. It couldn't change. It was frozen in place. And so if I had said to the IBMers, look, here's the vision. Here's the vision of the future. They would have loved that, because that would have given them another 6 months to sit around and debate the vision. Because IBMers are really smart people. They're probably like people at universities. They can raise any subject to the highest level of abstraction in 20 minutes. And so we would have had an endless debate as to whether I had the right vision or not, when in fact we had to get going. We were running out of money. We were running out of cash. We were running out of commitment on the part of our employees.
Yeah.
So we had to move. We had to go do some things.
But in that same regard, there was, you wrote in your book that the gurus all tell you, and you actually wanted to do this, you did not want to make any really big decisions in the first 100 days, but that you found you had no choice. And you had, because you had to move, you had to make a decision.
I've decided that that statement, which I've heard for 30 years in my business career, works only in guru heaven. I mean, it is very hard to go in and lead an institution and sit around and do nothing for months. It just doesn't work that way. So I had to grab hold of IBM and shake it to, in a sense, get it out of its, it was a deer in the headlights. And I had to make some decisions early on. Now, I tried to avoid making decisions for which my qualifications were very dim, like technical decisions. I tried to not bet the company, although I did bet the company 60 days after I got there by making the decision to keep the company together.
Right. Before we get to that decision, because that was a critical moment, you did make a decision very, very early on that was highly risky, but you felt you had no choice. And that was your mainframe, which was the heart and soul of the company, was also much more expensive than the competitors, but it was a way for the company to keep revenue coming in. And your company people, your finance people, wanted to keep the price up, but you had to make a different decision. Tell us about that.
Well, to me, IBM, I had been a customer. IBM had plenty of saliency. It had plenty of reason to be. It had plenty of customer support. And they were the people that most wanted IBM to succeed. Mm-hmm. When you think about it, other than our employees, our best customers were desperate for IBM to succeed. Our competitors were cheering. They were hoping we would collapse. The media was looking for a great big collapse. That always helps sell advertising. And so when I went to the customers, they said, look, we want to help. We want to help. But the thing you got to do is you got to give us some reasonable prices, and we'll keep buying. We want to buy more mainframes, but you've priced them out of the market. So my point of view was to the IBMers from the day I got there, we're going to build the company from the market back. Whatever that says, that's what we're going to do. And so customers are saying mainframes are too expensive. That's driving them to alternative products more than their belief that the alternative products are better. We cut the price of the mainframe. We have cut it every single year since I've been there. It's now 1/100th of the cost it was. And this year we sold more mainframe processing than has ever existed in the world. Sold more than we've ever sold in any other year.
What gave you the confidence to make that decision? Because it was such a risky one for your company.
I don't know. I really didn't have a lot of choices. I mean, when you come into a situation that was as dire as I did, you've got to trust your instincts. You got to trust what, in a sense, what did you bring to the situation? And what I brought was the voice of the customer. I mean, that's what I brought to IBM. If I had had to make a major technical decision in those first few months, I would have been a bad choice. That's what I kept telling the search committee in advance. But I knew it was the right thing to do from a customer point of view. I knew we needed to hang on to those customers. I knew their support was important, and I knew you don't gouge customers. I mean, you don't do that.
Yeah.
You give customers a good price, and then you go figure out how to construct a cost environment that you can live with.
But now, you call them the PC bigots. The folks who had convinced many in the media especially, but others, that mainframes were something from the past.
Right.
And that PCs were the future, that all that computing could be done out in a little box on the desk.
Right. That was an extraordinary piece of mythology that got created in the 80s. And we've now come to realize that it was really a silly idea, that you can't run banking systems, you can't run insurance systems, you can't run airline systems on PCs. They're not designed for that. If they were designed for that, then you couldn't do the things you do on PCs. They're designed for two different things. One is designed for personal productivity, for an individual to extend his or her personal productivity in the things they do every day. And the other one is designed to do massive transaction processing in a totally secure environment. I mean, they weren't, the idea that one could do the other one's job was really silly at the time.
But there was almost a sense in which people inside IBM had lost their confidence.
Yes, they did. Yes, they did.
They lost their confidence that the mainframes did represent the future.
Absolutely. What happened is that the company got in trouble, and it started to believe its critics instead of itself. It lost its confidence, despite the fact that the customers were saying, we still want more of these big processors. How could we possibly run a huge corporate system on a PC, particularly the kind of PCs that existed then? I mean, even today, you know, the statistics say that the average personal computer sort of stops working 15 or 16 times a day. And what you do is you restart it, shut it down, reboot it, start it down, reboot it. You could, if you tried to do that with the telephone system or a medical system or a military system, I mean, you'd fall apart. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, an economic problem in the company caused a shock to the system. And competitors took advantage of it and said, there's a new model of computing. And when IBM couldn't renew itself, it sort of said, well, oh, gee, then maybe this model is the way to go. But as it's proven, it hasn't been the right model.
Yeah. Well, that lack of confidence must have contributed in some way to the decision that was made before you got there to break up IBM into parts and really make it much more of a conglomerate. And you wrote in your book that the single most important decision you made at IBM, and indeed the most important decision you made in your business life, was to reverse that trend and go the other way.
It was a huge decision in the sense that if I had come into IBM and simply executed in a better way the strategy that had been created by my predecessor, there would not be an IBM today. There would not be an IBM today. It would have been broken up into lots of little pieces, and very importantly, the crucible of research, IBM Research, which is arguably the most important private research institution in the world, it would have disappeared. Just like you see Bell Labs starting to disappear after the breakup of AT&T. There would have been no way to support that extraordinary research institution, because once the company had been broken up into a lot of little pieces, who was going to pay for it? Who was going to pay the $6 billion of research? So it really was a huge decision that in a sense, was very counterintuitive at the time. Again, some in the media thought that, I had really lost my mind. But you know what, David? That was not a hard decision for me. As a customer, that was an easy decision for me. I mean, as a customer, I didn't want a bunch of little IBMs to go along with a bunch of little other things. We had all kinds of little companies in the computer industry at that time. I wanted somebody that could integrate all of this technology. I wanted somebody that could look across the whole industry, somebody that could help me put it all together. That's what I wanted when I was a customer, and there was only one person that could do that, was IBM. Unfortunately, IBM was not able to execute that very well at the time.
Right.
And what really was the hardest decision I ever made was getting IBM to now live up to that role of being an integrated company.
But, okay, I see these big major decisions you're making. The role of the leader in that situation. Is it to make, you have to sort of fall back on your own resources, to call in 2 or 3 people you really trust, and go with your gut instinct. Best information you can get, go with your gut instinct, and roll the dice sometimes, because you got to do that to save the company, or this is what the future is, and you then bring everybody else with you. How do you do that as a leader?
Yeah, that's really the interesting question, because I really don't believe that, as I said earlier, I don't believe that the most difficult part of being a leader is giving a sense of direction. Although, obviously, without that, you don't even begin to be a leader. I mean, you got to tell people, this is what we're going to be, this is where we want to get to, this is our expression of what leadership means. But, as I say in my book, people don't do what you expect. They do what you inspect. And so the issue of now, how do you take a huge enterprise and make sure that it goes out and executes? Execution is much harder than vision. It's much harder getting an institution aligned to do something. There's a lot of agendas inside an organization. Even an organization probably the size of the Kennedy School.
We've noticed.
And in an institution like IBM, which is not a classic manager-worker institution, it's 300,000 professionals. I mean, we have more Nobel laureates than most countries. We've won every major physics prize and computer science prize. These are all very smart people who have a very strong view on what ought to be done. And if it isn't what they think ought to be done, then in the old days it didn't get done. So to me, the critical task of a leader in transformation, in changing an institution, is you've got to create a sense of crisis. You have got to create a sense of crisis. No organization is going to change in a fundamental way unless it believes there's real pain staying the way we are. And so I had the benefit of the conditions you described. I mean, billions of dollars of losses, cutting the dividend, people being fired for the first time in the history of the company, not by me, but by my predecessor, and then by me. I finally got the IBMers to understand we really need to do something different or we're all in trouble. And to me, that is the sine qua non of transformation. You've got to create that sense of crisis. It's got to be there. I think it's why even our government tends to seem to work better when we're facing a threat from outside. It's a sense of, I got to do something differently, I got to come together, there's an urgency, and I got to give up something. Having created that sense of urgency, then you can go and say, now let's talk about how you execute this strategy, how you execute this vision, how you arrive at this vision.
Right. Lest I leave the impression that you went entirely with your gut on a lot of this. you made it very clear in the book that when you were trying to arrive at a series of strategies for the company, the 4 or 5 things that you wanted to have the company focus on over the future, that you rolled up your sleeve and went deep down into the facts and wanted to get the best analysis that you could. That's what you did, and that's what you expected your top people to do in order to make informed strategic decisions. It wasn't just sort of off the top.
Well, yes, I believe very strongly that it's hard to create a real strategy. It's hard to get people to buy in, and it's hard to get people to then go and execute if you don't give them a compelling argument based on, in my case, market facts. Here's what's happening. Here's why we have to change. Here's what the customer wants. Here's an analysis that says we got $9 billion of excess cost compared to our competitors. I mean, I don't want to argue. Here's the $9 billion. You know, come look at the numbers. We'll share. Let everybody in the company look at the numbers. We got a problem. And so now let's all go figure out how we're going to do it. You know, without an analytical underpinning to a direction you want people to go, I mean, not many of them are going to be there because they're just going to swap opinions. And people love to swap opinions rather than take difficult steps. So we had to really dig through the analysis of what was going on, starting with the customer and then back through our cost structure and back into the technology, rigorous analysis.
Had you learned that at McKinsey?
Yes. That was the one thing that I really valued out of my 10 years as a consultant. I mean, I really learned how to take a company apart and to really do a detailed analysis of the facts of the competitive environment, the company situation, the economic, financial, all of that. It's a real skill.
It's a real professionalization, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Get yourself in there and get there.
Yes, it is. But it's also the mindset of an independent. The mindset of, I'm going to get the facts first, and then I'll draw some conclusions. And one of the things that I find interesting about, some companies, but in particular non-profit organizations, is the fact gathering, if it takes place at all, it sort of follows along with the conclusion the person wants to reach. And we sort of go find facts to make the case we want to make. It's a different kind of logic than going and getting the facts and letting the conclusions fall out. And that clearly was the case. The latter was the case in IBM. I mean, IBM was a group of competing fiefdoms, and everybody had their set of facts to make their point. And one of the things I had to do in my first year there was to make it very clear to everybody we were going to have a common set of facts. We were not going to spend the first 50 minutes of every hour debating who had the right facts, which is a neat way to prevent decisions from happening. Argue over who's got the right facts. No, we had the facts in the first 10 minutes, and then in the next 50 minutes of the hour, we figured out the right thing to do. So that this process of how you brought deep analytical focus to the company was very important in the early years.
In that first 6 months, you basically made enough decisions that you pulled it together and stopped the hemorrhaging. You stopped the market slide so the company could survive. But then you had to go into this second phase of laying out a strategy so that you would restore the company as a leader. Again, something that looked very difficult to do. You then had to make a series of strategic decisions about how to do that. One of the most important, and the one I found most intriguing, was the notion of betting on what the industry was going to look like in the future, and then betting what kind of company IBM ought to be to get there, and you were going to change IBM, change the whole nature of IBM, basically from a manufacturing company to an integrator that was also a big service company. So you had to make two very large judgments. You had to make a judgment about what the future held in the industry, and then how you fit into that future as a company. Walk us through that a little.
Well, first of all, as I mentioned earlier, once I made the decision to keep the company together, I had to have a reason for that, and the reason was that we were going to be the company that helped customers integrate, to help to apply the technology, not just throw hardware at them and software at them and Unix servers and PC servers. I mean, that's the way the industry works today. I mean, people throw the technology and you throw this stuff over the wall and say, of course you want more. It's faster. This is version 46.7. Of course you want that. It's got 2 million more lines of code. And so we had a chance to be the company that not only created technology, but helped you apply it. Okay, so that was the first decision. However, that led to the fact that I now had to get IBM to work inside. I had to deliver on that promise because IBM couldn't deliver on that promise. It was an incredible decentralized company with fiefdoms all over the place. People didn't talk to each other. People withheld information from other parts of the company. People would go out to a customer and sell their product and denigrate another IBM product. I mean, it was the farthest thing from an integrated company inside. So I then had to go work on how do we make this company execute internally the way we said we were going to work externally. And then I got lucky. I got lucky because I was looking for what is the thing? What can I build this integration around? What's my moonshot? I needed a moonshot. I needed something that everybody could say, we're going to do this together. And along came the internet. And it just saved me. Because I got the whole company to say, gee, we were the leader in mainframe. We were not the leader in the PC era. We lost that. And a lot of people in the company were trying to fight that old war forever. And I said, no. We're not going to fight that war anymore. We lost that war. Here's this new thing. And in 1995, we announced what we called network-centric computing, which was a really clunky term. I mean, it was really clunky. Not bad for the computer industry, but certainly clunky by the consumer businesses I had been in before. And it became the galvanizing force that suddenly everybody in IBM said, we got a chance to be a leader again. We now, if we put it together, we can go for leadership again. Mm-hmm. Nobody believed us because we were still viewed as a recovering alcoholic. That we were probably not going to make it. And we got ourselves to the point where, in fact, we became the leader through the development of our e-business campaign. So if I had not had that sort of thematic message, that kind of moonshot to go after, I'm not quite sure how I would have gotten the whole company together.
Mm-hmm. Do you think luck often comes to strong leaders? More often comes to strong leaders?
I don't know. I've never thought about that. I'll never forget my first job when I was 18. I was working in a paper factory in Pennsylvania, and my boss called me in at one point, and he said, now look, I know you're going back to college. I just want to remind you of something. Success in life is 50% skill and 50% luck. So don't get too arrogant about your skills. So yeah, luck plays a role, but it sometimes bad luck plays a role for people.
Cultural transformation, you said, and you mentioned this earlier. For the longer haul, the hardest part, to your surprise, was just, well, maybe not to your surprise, was changing the culture of an organization, a large organization. This has obvious ramifications for government and for other institutions. What did you learn about changing the culture of an institution? How do you do it?
Well, what I learned is that it is far more important than I ever dreamed. I mean, the only good thing I got out of the incredibly difficult task of writing this book, because remember, I wrote this book nights and weekends. I mean, I did have a full-time job when I was writing this book.
You actually wrote it.
And I actually wrote it. I mean, I discovered after the fact that, people keep coming up to me and saying, well, who wrote it? And I look around and I say, what, do you mean people write other people's books? I said, I don't remember being able to send someone in to play a golf game for me. I mean, this is me. I'm swinging the club. I'm holding the pen. I got to write the book. So the lesson that I really took away that was an insight I didn't have before was how powerful the unwritten rules of an institution are in what it does and how much you can change it, and what it'll accept and what it'll do, and that culture to me was one of 8 or 9 things that you might have listed down. Okay, I'm a leader. I need to worry about customers and finance and manufacturing and human resources and culture. And no, culture is everything. Culture is the crucible that everything sits in, and if it isn't right, nothing goes on inside. And so what's really hard, I discovered, is that there are a lot of institutions that basically have no culture. I mean, it's a flabby culture. There's nothing important about it. They change all the time. They have a series of mediocre leaders. I mean, the world's full of those kind of organizations. The hardest organizations to change are the ones that are really successful. Huh. Successful institutions tend to create very strong cultures. They tend to codify. They go out and they say, gee, we're really great. Now, why are we great? Oh, let's write it down. And let's try to, in a sense, capture the knowledge we have about what works well. And manuals get done, and training courses get done, and people are sort of told what to do. And by the way, as long as things don't change, that's a very good thing to do. Codifying a culture is a good thing to do. I mean, it is knowledge transfer. It's great until the world changes. Mm-hmm. And when the culture is no longer appropriate for the new world, people keep working on changing and forgetting that it's this culture back here that's keeping the organization from moving. I use the example in my book that I got a lot of press for changing the dress code at IBM. I mean, not as much as saying we didn't need a vision right then, but I got a lot of press for changing the dress code. Well, you know what? The dress code in IBM was created probably 60 or 70 years ago by the founder, Mr. Watson, and it was eminently sensible at that time. It says you're going to go out and sell computers, very expensive machines, to senior business people. Dress like a senior business person, and senior business people at that time wore blue suits and white shirts and ties. And when our customers changed, and when a lot of our customers who bought computers looked like some of the people in this room with blue jeans and white socks and no ties, guess what? We didn't change the dress code. And all I did was say, we're going back to old man Watson's philosophy, which is dress for your customer. So it was an example of where something that made a lot of sense culturally in the old world The whole world changed, and this thing, this cultural behavior is hanging here like a beam from a ceiling after the walls have been torn down. And so until we got to talk about culture, until we got to say to people, this isn't working about lots of things, the organization wasn't going to change.
Did you have to change the compensation system to change the culture?
Yes. Yes. Because remember the theory of the case here. You've got it. We're going to keep company together because we're going to be the integrator. That means we have to have an integrated IBM inside. That means the culture has to support a single IBM inside. Well, the compensation system did not support a single IBM inside. It was every man, woman, and child for themselves. So everybody's compensation was directly related to what they sold or what they did, and the whole company could do terrible, but lots of people could make lots of money because it was a totally individually driven compensation system. So it became a big deal in the company when I announced 6 or 7 months after I was there that all of the people that reported to me, who, by the way, were line executives running big separate businesses, that their total compensation was going to be on IBM's performance as a whole. I mean, this was really heresy in corporate compensation theory. The person running the services group didn't get paid for the services company results, got paid for the total company's results. And we cascaded it down. Next level down was 40% of their total pay was on IBM results and 60% their own units. We then put in a plan that every single IBMer got a piece of incentive compensation. Everybody, 250,000 of them. And it was all on IBM results. So it was a powerful reinforcement in the culture of the strategy that we had created earlier.
And did you also tie them to the idea of single IBM as a brand? Because when you go out there, there were 17 advertising companies.
70
advertising companies. 70 for the company.
Yes. Well, see, as part of the disaggregation of the company, you know, when I arrived and the company was being busted up into individual companies, it was going to be disaggregated. Managers or executives who were selected to run these soon-to-be spun-off companies were very happy with this. I mean, they thought they were now going to run their own companies and they were going to have their own stock and they were going to get away from Mother IBM and all those corporate types who, you know, kept telling them what they could do. Well, they hired advertising agencies to create their own brands. So you could pick out an ad. You could pick up a magazine, a Business Week, and you could see 8 or 10 ads in that magazine from IBM, separate IBM divisions. And the logo was different. The representation of the company, the messaging was different. You would have no idea they were the same companies, except somewhere along there you'd see an I, a B, and an M. So we grabbed hold of that. We centralized all of the messaging in the company and went from 70 advertising agencies in the U.S. I don't know how many hundreds of others we had outside the U.S. We went to one single agency for the whole world. And that, too, was a decision that met with some skepticism from outside.
I've got one last question to ask you, and then I want to go. We've got a couple of people here who are going to ask, and then we're going to go to the floor. Passion. Passion. That word comes up repeatedly in your book, and then you discuss it toward the end of the book as being so critical to a leader. And you said that you never heard the word passion at the Harvard Business School that you could recall. And then you had this very interesting conversation about jobs just before you left, Procter & Gamble as well as McKinsey. But yet you discovered over time that passion was so important.
I guess I think that a leader that doesn't have skin in the game, that doesn't really care, that doesn't show the people, the people, the team they're trying to lead. If you're not there, if you're not caring, if you're not working shoulder to shoulder with those people, if you're not carrying the burden of everyday execution, if you can't be inspirational, if you can't show your real self, and you're just going to be intellectual, you're going to send out memos, or you're going to describe principles, and you're going to do that, you're not a leader. Not to me. Leaders are involved. Leaders take risks. Leaders are part of what they're leading. They're not detached from it. And who wants to work for some Wizard of Oz who hides behind some curtain and bangs on the drum and out come these pronouncements? You know, who wants to work for a pessimist? Who wants to work for people who you know, they don't seem to care. They intellectualize everything. So I'm not saying that you can be a leader by being a dummy. I mean, you know, it isn't you know, being a cheerleader and running up and down the sideline cheering, and meanwhile the team's losing 100-0. But if you're going to ask somebody to work hard, to change, to make a commitment, well, you got to have your own commitment, and they got to see it. They got to see that you care, and you know, and you got to be there at 10 o'clock at night when they're at 10 o'clock at night. You got to remember to say thank you, and you got to remember to understand people's personal lives and understand the turmoil they're going through. And I mean, it's a human activity, leadership, and I think it gets people tend to try to make it intellectual.
Warren Bennis is going to ask our first question. Warren is a man who is teaching now both at the Kennedy School and at the Business School. He has written some 24 books on leadership. I dare not call him a guru from guru heaven, but he is an authority. Warren, do you want to use a microphone back here? Yeah.
Thank you for your book and for being here. It's a very good book.
Thank you
for that. The way you described IBM when you took it over reminded me of my days as a university president. It was one said about the universities in general that it's a collection of colleges, institutes, centers, departments, teams, residence halls, etc., held together only by a central heating system. And sounds like IBM didn't even have that when you took it over. And I was also impressed with one of the lines you made today was about habit, when a company gets into a habit. So I'm going to be greedy and ask you two questions if I can, Lou. One is, do you think that someone from the inside, when you came there in '93, could have made the kind of cultural transformation that you made at IBM? That's question one. And the second one is kind of related, because in your book, when you talk about personal qualities, one of the things that comes through is integrity. It's sort of related to the same first question, actually. How did you get that cascaded down, that sense of probity, integrity, and transparency? So those are the two on my mind.
The first question, I want to preface my answer by saying, in general, as a board member and a participant in the corporate world in general, I think bringing a CEO in from outside is a very dangerous thing to do. I think the odds are pretty clear. The percentage of people who succeed at that is not high enough for that to be anything other than a risky strategy. But in this case, I honestly believe it took an outsider to change IBM. Now, why? One, because IBM got in trouble so quickly. I mean, IBM, as David pointed out in that incredible summary that he gave without notes, I was looking for the teleprompter. I mean, IBM was the leading company in the world for 3 decades. I mean, it was constantly picked as the #1 company. Got to 1990, record profits. By 1993, it was dying. I mean, it just fell into an abyss. Secondly, so there was no time sort of for a gradual change. Secondly, the culture had become so strong because it had been so successful that anybody inside was a creature of that culture and might not have even seen it. I mean, you know, one of the interesting thoughts that I'd like to, at some point, think about doing some research on, maybe you've done it because you've done some of the best research in the business world, is how do you see a culture after you've been there? How do you see it? I used to tell my McKinsey consultants that the minute they went into a new client, they would take a notebook and write down everything they saw that they thought was strange, because 6 months later, they'd never realize it was strange. So, I mean, I'm not sure how you see a culture after you're a part of it. So the answer to your first question is that I think an outsider was necessary in this case. To your question about integrity, integrity is a very important word. And I think I view it as, it has two very separate dimensions or related dimensions. One is personal integrity. And you know, I think personal integrity is pretty close to morality. It's how you grew up. It's the value you have. And I just think that if you have somebody who lacks personal integrity, it's very hard to get them to be part of institutional integrity. So my philosophy as a leader has always been, if I sense there's somebody in my organization that just lacks personal integrity, I don't care how successful they are, they got to go. They got to go. I mean, you give them a second chance or a third chance, but they got to go. Now, institutional integrity, to me, starts with something we talked about earlier, which is a commitment to honesty and tough-minded analysis of the facts. You know, let's not try to change facts. Let's not try to hide what's really going on. Let's not try to avoid facing up to problems. Because I think that a lot of institutional integrity falls apart when people try to cover up problems. And that means you've got to create an environment where people don't get shot, figuratively speaking, for surfacing problems. That people get a chance to say, look, I'm having a problem here. I'm really, you know, my market's falling apart, or my product didn't work, and, you know, we made a mistake. Now we've got to go fix it. And I think that an environment which encourages, almost requires people to be honest and forthcoming about problems really helps create the kind of integrity I think you need in an organization. And then finally, as I say in my book, I think CEOs or leaders make lots and lots of decisions in their week or month, and it's how you make some of the little decisions that send a message about integrity. And I mentioned an example in my book about somebody who does something wrong, but his or her manager comes to the CEO and says, oh, but they promised they'll never do it again, and they're really important to this project. I mean, I know this is something that we normally let people go, but we really need to keep this person. I'm sure they won't do it again. And so if you allow an organization to be one where it's easier to ask forgiveness than permission, then you really have lost a sense of integrity.